Dawn, September 3, 1945. The fishing village of Yokosuka lay silent under a grey curtain of mist rising from the bay. Once a proud naval stronghold, its piers now sagged beneath the boots of occupying American troops. The war had ended, but the air still reeked of smoke, salt, and despair. Families shuffled along broken roads, gaunt from years of rationing and bombardment. Children clutched empty rice bowls. Mothers stared into the fog with hollow eyes. Hunger was their new enemy, an enemy as merciless as any aerial raid. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. American patrols moved cautiously through the wreckage, rifles slung but ready, their radios crackling faintly with coded reports. Yet what came next was not the clash of victors and vanquished. Instead, something unexpected, something that defied the rigid expectations of conquest, unfolded. An American soldier, Private First Class Robert Whitman of the 27th Infantry Division, broke open his field ration pack, tore off a chunk of chocolate, and placed it gently into the hands of a shivering child. U.S. Army Occupation Log, Sept. 1945. The boy's mother, her face etched with exhaustion, hesitated. Her lips quivered as though fearing a trick. Japanese civilians had been told to expect cruelty, brutality, annihilation. Instead, here was a conqueror offering food. The boy devoured the chocolate, his eyes widening with disbelief. Tears welled in his mother's eyes. For the villagers watching, it was not just the taste of sugar after years of scarcity. It was the first spark of a reality they could not yet comprehend. The enemy was feeding them. Civilians' oral testimony, Kanagawa Prefecture Archive. In that instant, the atmosphere of fear fractured. Rumors had spread for months that Americans were demons, barbarians who would burn, kill, and dishonor. Propaganda posters had painted them as monsters. Yet the reality, embodied in a single shared meal, was more complicated. An occupying force that carried rifles in one hand and food in the other. Imperial Japanese Home Ministry Memo, 1944. The broader context behind this quiet moment was staggering. Japan's surrender in August 1945 had left more than 70 million people on the brink of starvation. Allied blockade, strategic bombing, and the collapse of shipping lanes had strangled imports. Rice harvests had fallen by nearly 40%. Urban families survived on little more than millet, barley, and watery soups. Malnutrition diseases, beriberi, rickets, dysentery, spread unchecked. By September, Tokyo's average caloric intake had dropped below 1,600 calories per day, far less than the minimum for survival. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, Food and Agriculture, 1946. American planners understood this famine could ignite rebellion. General Douglas MacArthur, appointed Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, was keenly aware that feeding Japan was not merely humanitarian, it was strategic. If civilians starved, resentment would boil, undermining occupation policy. If they were fed, loyalty or at least acceptance might follow. "We must win peace through bread, as surely as we won war through bombs," one officer remarked. SCAP Civil Affairs Report, Oct. 1945. But on the ground, soldiers themselves became the first bridge between policy and survival. Rations designed for combat were suddenly lifelines for civilians. The American C ration box, containing canned meat, biscuits, coffee powder, and that most coveted of luxuries, chocolate, became a symbol of both power and compassion. Engineers back in the States, men and women in Detroit assembly lines, New Jersey canneries, and Hershey's chocolate plants had mass-produced millions of these boxes, never imagining they would one day pass from soldier to former enemy child. Quartermaster Corps Procurement Memo, 1944. The contrast between expectation and reality was profound. Japanese civilians, conditioned by years of propaganda, braced for cruelty. Yet they saw foreign soldiers kneel to share food with the weak. Many refused at first, suspicion etched into their faces. But hunger overcame fear. Slowly, trust flickered. A handful of biscuits passed from glove to palm was not just a meal. It was a gesture that shattered years of indoctrination. Kanagawa Prefecture Diary, Sept. 1945, archival reports from the era describe scenes repeated across villages and cities, Americans breaking open ration cans on street corners, children crowding around, mothers bowing deeply, fathers silently watching from shadows. Some civilians wept, others fell to their knees in disbelief. The enemy had become a provider. Occupation Field Report, Yokohama, Sept. 1945. Yet for the soldiers themselves, these acts were instinctive, unplanned. Many were farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Michigan, coal miners from Pennsylvania, men who had grown up with Depression-era hunger. They understood what an empty stomach meant. Sharing food felt natural. We had more than we needed. They had nothing, one veteran later recalled. It wasn't charity. It was just human. Veteran Oral History, Library of Congress, 1983. Still, not all was simple compassion. Behind every ration bar handed out lay the weight of strategy. Feeding civilians calmed restlessness, softened resistance, and began the slow process of reshaping Japan into an ally rather than an enemy. In the rubble of war, food became a weapon of peace. SCAP Economic Policy Brief, Nov. 1945. The power of this exchange was psychological as much as physical. For Japanese civilians, the gesture overturned years of fear. For American soldiers, it reinforced a sense of moral victory, proof that they were not conquerors in the old sense, but liberators of a defeated nation from starvation itself. The battlefield had ended, but a new struggle of trust, survival, and identity had begun. U.S. Army Psychological Operations Report, 1945. As days turned into weeks, the pattern spread. From Okinawa to Hokkaido, reports surfaced of American troops giving rations to families, organizing soup kitchens, distributing canned goods. Civilians whispered among themselves, perhaps the occupiers were not demons after all. Each meal shared eroded the wall of fear, one bite at a time. Civil Affairs Division Summary, Dec. 1945. Yet in the shadows, unease remained. Some Japanese officers, stripped of command but still clinging to pride, viewed this feeding with suspicion. Was it kindness or was it control? Was bread simply another form of domination, sugar another chain of subjugation? Former IJA officer interrogation, Nov. 1945. The answer, as history would reveal, was both. Food was survival. Food was power. Food was diplomacy. In the shattered ruins of Japan, the greatest weapon America wielded was not the atom bomb or the aircraft carrier. It was the ration box in a soldier's hand. And that weapon was only beginning to show its full force, because behind every bite of chocolate, every spoonful of soup, lay a secret network of logistics, technology, and planning that would decide the fate of the occupation. The civilians saw compassion. The soldiers felt duty. But beneath it all, an invisible machine of supply chains and innovations made it possible. And in the months to come, that machine would transform not only hunger into sustenance, but enemies into reluctant allies. The true story of how America fed a nation and reshaped the future was only just beginning. December 1945. Snow blanketed the battered fields of northern Honshu, muffling the cries of children whose bellies ached with hunger. The rice harvest had failed again, silenced by shortages of fertilizer and the collapse of transport networks. Civilians bartered family heirlooms for a few handfuls of millet, their desperation echoing through narrow streets, still littered with rubble. Yet amid the despair, trucks bearing white stars rumbled through villages, their engines coughing steam into the winter air. They carried not bombs but food, and with them arrived the hidden advantage that had baffled Japanese civilians from the first days of occupation: the relentless machinery of American logistics. SCAP Civil Affairs Report, Dec. 1945. To the untrained eye, a soldier's act of handing over a chocolate bar seemed spontaneous. But in truth, every biscuit and can of meat that reached a starving family was the product of a vast system engineered years before the war ended. At the heart of this system were the rations themselves, scientifically designed, mass-produced, and shipped by the ton. The Standard C ration, created by Army Quartermaster researchers in 1938 and refined through wartime experience, was a technological marvel disguised as a tin of meat and beans. Each ration weighed roughly 2.5 pounds, compact enough for soldiers to carry, yet dense with over 3,700 calories of protein, fat, and sugar. It contained tins of meat, pork and beans, meat stew or hash, biscuits fortified with vitamins, soluble coffee, sugar tablets, and, its most treasured component, a slab of Hershey's Field Ration D chocolate, engineered to resist melting in tropical heat. Technical Manual TM 10412, 1943. Behind the scenes, This miracle of preservation and portability was the work of food technologists like Colonel Paul P. Logan, who oversaw the Army's food ration division. Chemists experimented with canning processes, vacuum sealing, and vitamin enrichment. Factories in Chicago, Pittsburgh, and Newark converted from civilian products to military rations, producing millions of units per month. Hershey's Pennsylvania plant alone churned out over 24 million chocolate bars per week by 1945, a staggering figure that dwarfed Japan's crippled confectionery industry. Quartermaster Corps Production Report 1945. Japanese soldiers and civilians alike had no counterpart to this scale. Wartime shortages had forced the Imperial Army to rely on simple rice balls, dried fish, and millet cakes, often lacking critical nutrients. By 1944, even frontline troops suffered from vitamin deficiencies and weight loss. Civilians fared worse, their diet stripped of meat and dairy. When they first encountered American rations, metal tins that opened to reveal steaming stews, biscuits that stayed crisp for months, and chocolate bars that tasted of a forgotten abundance, it seemed almost supernatural. Dramatized composite, it was like eating food from another world, recalled one Yokohama dockworker. Kanagawa Oral History Collection. But rations were only one part of the equation. The true hidden advantage lay in the logistical behemoth that delivered them. American supply lines, honed in campaigns across the Pacific, now shifted seamlessly from feeding troops to feeding civilians. Liberty ships, those squat, rugged cargo vessels mass-produced in shipyards from Baltimore to Portland, unloaded thousands of tons of wheat, flour, canned goods, and powdered milk at Yokohama, Kobe, and Sasebo. Each Liberty ship could carry 10,000 tons of cargo, and by late 1945, convoys were arriving weekly under Operation Blacklist's occupation supply schedule. Bureau of Ships Report 1945, from the docks, fleets of GMC CCKW trucks, 3-ton deuce-and-a-halfs, rolled into cities and villages, their rugged engines chewing through mud and snow alike. These trucks, designed by General Motors engineers in 1940, had already proven themselves the backbone of the Red Ball Express in Europe. Now they became lifelines for Japan. Civilians watched in awe as columns of American vehicles, each hauling crates of rations, snaked through towns that had not seen regular deliveries in months. Motor Transport Service Memo, Jan 1946. The enemy's disbelief was palpable. Japanese diaries captured the astonishment of ordinary citizens who had been told Americans were marauders. Instead, they witnessed an occupying army sustaining life with assembly line efficiency. "The Americans feed even their enemies better than our government fed us," one civilian scrawled bitterly in November 1945. Tokyo Metropolitan Diary Archive, 1945. Officers of the disbanded Imperial Army, summoned for post-war interrogations, admitted their shock at the scale of U.S. provisioning. Dramatized composite. "We thought the blockade starved us. Then we saw the enemy's warehouses, endless mountains of food." U.S. Army Interrogation Summary, Jan 1946. One decisive episode revealed the full extent of this hidden advantage. On February 1st, 1946, in Tokyo, rumors spread that rice stores had run dry. Crowds gathered, desperate and restless, threatening to spark riots. Into this volatile moment, American trucks rolled under orders from General MacArthur's Civil Affairs Division. Soldiers opened crates of flour, canned meats, and powdered milk in the shadow of the bombed-out Ginza district. They organized impromptu soup kitchens with Japanese volunteers, ladling steaming broth into tin cups as snow swirled. That day, more than 150,000 civilians received meals, diffusing a crisis that could have erupted into chaos. SCAP Food Distribution Report, Feb 1946. The technical details of this operation were as impressive as its humanitarian outcome. Food had been shipped from Portland, Oregon, aboard the Liberty ship SS William S. Ladd. It was unloaded at Yokohama Harbor in late January, where quartermaster officers logged and categorized the cargo. Within 48 hours, it was dispatched by truck convoy under the command of Major Robert Harding, assisted by engineers from the 2nd Logistical Command. Their precision timing ensured that Tokyo's distribution centers were stocked just as civilian unrest peaked. Quartermaster Daily Log, Jan 30, 1946. Japanese observers could scarcely comprehend such efficiency. Their own distribution systems, crippled by bombed rail lines and bureaucratic breakdowns, had collapsed under far less pressure. American logistics appeared limitless. For civilians, the arrival of food in the nick of time was interpreted as providence. For occupation authorities, it was evidence that control could be maintained through nourishment rather than force. Civil Affairs Psychological Report, March 1946. Behind the scenes, engineers and workers in the United States continued to drive this miracle. At the Chicago Corn Products plant, technicians refined powdered milk processes to ensure shelf stability. At canneries in California, women on assembly lines filled tins of peaches and beans, destined not for soldiers in foxholes, but for children in Tokyo classrooms. On the rails of Kansas, boxcars loaded with wheat rumbled eastward to ports, each ton destined to become bread in the hands of a former enemy. These anonymous workers, as critical to victory as any soldier, became silent actors in the drama of Japan's survival. War Food Administration Report 1946. For the Japanese, the shock of these systems was not only physical but existential. Propaganda had promised that American supply lines would collapse under Japan's attacks, that US soldiers were soft, dependent on luxuries. Instead, civilians watched as the occupiers moved food with the same precision as artillery. The war of logistics had been invisible during combat. Now in peacetime, its consequences were inescapable. The Imperial War Ministry debriefed 1946, and still the hunger persisted. Distribution could only relieve, not eliminate, the crisis. By the spring of 1946, malnutrition still stalked millions. But each convoy, each ration box, each steaming ladle chipped away at despair. For civilians who once believed Americans would kill them, the sight of soldiers delivering food instead was a disorienting revelation. For those soldiers, the act of feeding strangers reaffirmed a deeper sense of purpose, that the war's end had to mean more than conquest, it had to mean survival. Veteran Interview 1975. The secret was out. America's hidden advantage was not just weapons or bombs, but the invisible empire of supply that could pivot from destruction to salvation overnight. And the Japanese, long conditioned to believe in sacrifice and scarcity, now faced an occupying power whose strength lay not only in firepower, but in abundance. Yet what began as emergency relief would soon evolve into something larger, something far more strategic. Feeding Japan was not merely about keeping civilians alive. It was about reshaping hearts, minds, and allegiances. The question was no longer whether Americans could feed Japan, but what that feeding would mean for the future of both nations. By the summer of 1946, the shock of defeat had given way to the grinding struggle of survival. Across Japan's scarred cities, families queued outside makeshift distribution centers, clutching dented bowls and battered ration cards. What had begun as sporadic acts of generosity from individual soldiers had transformed into a nationwide system, engineered, monitored, and sustained by the United States. But the consequences reached far beyond calories and meals. Food had become a lever of strategy, a weapon of psychology, and ultimately a seed of transformation that would define the relationship between victors and vanquished. SCAP Food and Agriculture Report 1946. The psychological impact on civilians was profound. Japanese families had braced themselves for vengeance, expecting starvation or enslavement. Instead, they found themselves sustained by the very men they once feared. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey later recorded civilian testimonies that captured this disorientation. One mother in Osaka recalled, "I told my children not to beg, that Americans would strike them, but then a soldier gave them milk. They cried not from fear, but from the taste." U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, Morale Division, to 46. The effect was destabilizing. An entire worldview shattered, replaced by gratitude mingled with disbelief. Hunger made the lesson unavoidable. Survival now depended not on loyalty to the emperor, but on cooperation with the occupiers. For American troops, these encounters reshaped the meaning of victory. Many veterans, hardened by island battles from Tarawa to Okinawa, arrived in Japan expecting hostility. Instead, they saw emaciated children, hollow-eyed mothers and fathers humiliated by their inability to provide. Sharing rations gave soldiers a sense of moral superiority, a belief that they were not simply conquerors, but liberators of the starving. Dramatized composite. "We destroyed their cities," one Marine wrote in a letter home. But we're rebuilding their hope, one can of beans at a time. Marine Corps Letter Collection, 1945. This dual transformation, civilians reimagining their enemy, soldiers reframing their role, was not incidental. It was cultivated. General Douglas MacArthur understood that occupation could not rest on bayonets alone. His staff recognized food as a strategic instrument, crafting policies that linked distribution with governance. By early 1946, the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, ESCAP, had launched coordinated relief programs channeling U.S. surplus grain and milk into Japan. Between 1946 and 1949, American aid accounted for nearly 15% of Japan's total food supply, including over 2.2 million tons of wheat. SCAP Economic Division Report 1949. The scale was staggering. In March 1946, SCAP authorized the creation of school lunch programs in Tokyo and Yokohama. Powdered milk imported from Midwestern dairies was mixed with local rice or bread, feeding more than 1.6 million children within a year. For a generation that had grown up amid scarcity, this daily ritual became their first reliable meal. Teachers later testified that malnourished students gained weight and energy within months. Education Division Bulletin 1947. For Japanese children, the taste of American powdered milk became an indelible memory, a sensory link between survival and the occupier's benevolence. The effect on morale and governance was equally decisive. Riots over food, which had erupted in Tokyo and Kobe in late 1945, subsided as distribution normalized. Black markets persisted, but the perception that Americans were providing stability tempered unrest. Political scientists later noted that the feeding programs undercut radical movements that sought to exploit famine for revolutionary ends. By filling stomachs, the U.S. also filled the vacuum of authority. Political Science Quarterly Occupation Issue 1952. But feeding an enemy required more than shipments of wheat and milk. It demanded the relentless labor of engineers, technicians, and workers who never saw the ruins they helped to sustain. Quartermaster units in Japan constructed warehouses, refrigeration units, and distribution centers. Military engineers laid new roads to connect ports to rural towns. Civil affairs officers, armed with clipboards instead of rifles, calculated caloric requirements with mathematical precision. In Kansas and Iowa, farmers planted wheat under government contracts, their harvests destined not for American kitchens, but for foreign mouths. In Detroit, truck factories retooled to produce cargo vehicles for the Pacific. This vast collaboration, farmers, factory workers, soldiers, and administrators, formed an invisible army of sustenance. U.S. Department of Agriculture Annual Report 1947. For the Japanese, the consequences were deeply emotional. Former soldiers, stripped of rank and identity, often stood in ration lines beside their former adversaries. Some wept at the humiliation. Others marveled at the irony. Dramatized composite. We had fought to starve the Americans, one ex-sergeant later confessed, yet it was they who saved our children. Post-war veteran testimony, 1950. Women, once targets of propaganda warning of American brutality, now described soldiers who knelt to share food with toddlers. The transformation of perception was slow, uneven, and haunted by bitterness, but it was undeniable. Strategically, the results were revolutionary. Feeding programs blunted resentment, paving the way for political reforms, land redistribution, the drafting of a new constitution, the rise of democratic institutions. Hunger had once driven civilians into loyalty to the emperor. Now bread and milk fostered acceptance of a new order under American oversight. Scholars have since argued that without these programs, occupation reforms, from women's suffrage to labor rights, might have collapsed under mass unrest. Journal of Asian Studies, 1961. The legacy extended far beyond Japan's shores. During the Cold War, the lessons of 1945-1949 informed U.S. foreign policy, embedding the principle that food was power. The Marshall Plan in Europe, which followed in 1948, echoed the same strategy. Stabilize societies with bread to prevent revolution. In Korea, Vietnam, and later Iraq, American commanders studied SCAP's ration programs as case studies in hearts and minds operations. Food distribution became a cornerstone of counterinsurgency doctrine. U.S. Army Psychological Operations Manual 1952. Yet the cost was not forgotten. Many American families had lost sons in the Pacific, and the sight of their rations feeding former enemies stirred controversy back home. Letters to Congress questioned why our boys' food was going to those who had once cheered Pearl Harbor. Politicians defended the policy by framing it as insurance against future wars. Feeding Japan, they argued, was cheaper than fighting it again. Congressional Record, 1946. In Japan, memories of that period lingered in complex ways. For some, the taste of American chocolate remained a bittersweet emblem of defeat and dependence. For others, it became a symbol of survival, a moment when humanity overcame hatred. Decades later, elderly Japanese who had received rations as children recalled the scent of canned stew or the sweet bitterness of Hershey's bars with tears in their eyes. Their recollections blurred the line between humiliation and gratitude. NHK Oral History Project, 1980s. In the end, the most enduring legacy was not the calories consumed, but the trust built. In 4 short years, an act as simple as sharing rations had begun to reforge the bond between two nations. It demonstrated that in modern war and peace alike, logistics were not only instruments of destruction, but tools of reconciliation. Abundance, wielded with precision, could achieve what firepower never could. The transformation of an enemy into an ally. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. One American officer, reflecting decades later, put it bluntly, "We dropped bombs to end the war. But we handed out bread to win the peace," dramatized composite. And so, amid ruins where ash once choked the sky, the taste of chocolate and bread carried a lesson across generations, that in war's aftermath, mercy can be as decisive as might. For when nations crumble, it is not always the gun, the bomb, or the tank that shapes the future, but the simple act of sharing a meal,